He collapsed just 500 meters from the church, his blood staining the flooded road, his breath rattling in the rain. No one knew how many nights he had traveled, how many storms he had fought, or how many times the world had tried to break him. They only saw a battered shadow of a dog, dragging a broken body toward a casket that carried the only man he had ever loved. He was never supposed to make it this far. He was never supposed to understand loss. But loyalty carves its own kind of miracle into the world. This is not a story of how he survived. This is a story of why he chose to. If this story touches something in you, stay with us. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share where you are watching from. I would love to hear what moment gripped your heart the most. In a sleepy corner of Alabama, where the dirt roads stretched themselves between fields of dying corn and battered barns, stood a weather-beaten wooden house. The house, with its peeling white paint and sagging porch, had seen better days. Much like the man who lived inside. Elijah Brooks, a retired sergeant of the U.S. Army, lived alone save for his faithful German shepherd, Shadow. The sky stretched endlessly above them, a canvas of dimming gold as the days slid into dusk. Elijah, a tall, broad-shouldered black man with silver threading through his beard, sat on the porch steps. His fingers, scarred and calloused from years of service, absently stroked Shadow's thick fur. The dog rested his massive head against Elijah's knee, eyes half closed but alert, breathing in the fading warmth of the day. There was a silence between them that spoke louder than words ever could, a bond tempered by fire, loss, and a loyalty that went beyond simple companionship. Elijah's house was a shrine to memories. The worn photos on the mantelpiece captured a young soldier, medals glinting proudly on his chest, surrounded by comrades who mostly never made it back. Framed flags, dusty commendations, and a battered Purple Heart hung alongside a single photograph. Elijah, a decade younger, laughing as Shadow's oversized puppy paws clawed at his chest. That photo told their story found together on a battlefield that neither fully escaped. On that evening, a chill crept into the air earlier than usual. Elijah shifted slightly, coughing into a ragged handkerchief, a hollow sound that lingered too long in the heavy air. He looked down at Shadow, his voice a hoarse whisper. "If I fall, boy, you find me." The dog's ears twitched. He didn't understand the words, not yet, but somewhere in his primal, battle-aimed line, something stirred. The twilight deepened, shadows stretching across the porch. In the distance, the first howls of coyotes pierced the night, but neither Elijah nor Shadow moved. They stayed, locked in their shared silence. A battered pickup truck rumbled down the road, kicking up dust that drifted like ghostly figures past the porch. Elijah's eyes followed it absently before glazing over, thoughts adrift to a past littered with blood, brotherhood, and broken promises. He hadn't planned to end up here, on this forgotten stretch of earth. He had dreamed of a life bigger than the small town that once sneered at him for his skin and later saluted him for his uniform. Dreams of opening a mechanic shop, maybe teaching local kids to fix engines, giving them a future. But dreams have a way of dying quietly when bills pile up and the body starts breaking down. The Veterans Affairs office in town still mailed him letters he rarely opened, filled with words like benefits pending and paperwork delayed. After a while, Elijah stopped believing help would come. It was just him and Shadow now. Him and the dog who had once dragged his bleeding body out of enemy fire in a nameless desert half a world away. Inside the house, a small radio crackled to life. Gospel music drifted out in broken, tinny notes. Elijah's head bobbed slightly in rhythm, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Shadow thumped his tail against the wood, a slow, steady beat, as if keeping time. That night felt heavier than others. Not for any clear reason. There was no storm brewing, no news on the radio warning of coming troubles, just a weight pressing down. A knowing that some changes ride into your life quietly, like mist through an open window. Before heading in for the night, Elijah reached into his worn jacket pocket and pulled out a crumpled photograph. A picture of the funeral home's flyer, where he had once made quiet arrangements. Just in case, a wry smile ghosted across his face. "Not much of a send-off, huh, boy?" he muttered. Shadow's eyes lifted to meet his, deep pools of silent understanding. Elijah chuckled softly, then ruffled the dog's fur. "You make sure I ain't alone, you hear?" Later that night, under a sky studded with cold, indifferent stars, Elijah tucked himself into bed, the weight of the day pressing harder against his chest. Shadow curled on the floor beside him, his body tense, ears twitching at every creak of the old house. Somewhere in the night, Elijah's breathing slowed, became shallow, then stopped altogether. But Shadow did not sleep. He laid his head near the bedpost, the scent of Elijah heavy in his nostrils, the world outside fading to nothing but the thud of his own anxious heart. The dawn crept in pale and slow, spreading an anemic light across the cracked wooden floor. When the men from the county arrived, dressed in their somber black suits and tight, uncomfortable shoes, Shadow barred the door. He growled low and steady, body rigid. It took all their coaxing, their pleading, and eventually their force to move him aside. As Elijah's body was lifted onto a stretcher, Shadow whimpered, pressing himself against the threshold, trembling but unyielding. The house emptied, leaving only silence and dust motes swirling in shafts of light. Shadow stood in the doorway for a long time, watching the dust settle. Then, as if steeling himself for something vast and unknowable, he turned his head towards the horizon where the men had disappeared, and sat, waiting, watching. In that stillness, something ancient and unbreakable took root in his bones. Shadow didn't know about death the way humans did. He didn't know about ceremonies or burial plots. But he knew his mission. The man who had saved him, fed him, loved him, was not done with him yet. The whisper Elijah left behind was not just a memory. It was a command. And Shadow, trained soldier of fur and heart, would obey. Inside the creaking skeleton of the old wooden house, dawn unfurled in sickly pale tendrils, spilling weak light across the floorboards worn smooth by time and sorrow. The air hung heavy with the scent of aged wood, dust, and something colder, something final. Elijah Brooks lay still atop the faded mattress, one arm curled protectively around a battered velvet box that contained his most sacred relic, the Purple Heart, awarded for wounds both seen and unseen. His chest, once broad enough to carry the burdens of many, no longer rose and fell. His face, lined by battles fought in foreign lands and domestic battles fought within, had settled into a profound, almost regal stillness. Shadow remained rooted to the spot beside the bed, his body taut with confusion, with dread. His nose nudged Elijah's slack hand, first gently, then with increasing desperation. There was no response, only the mechanical whine of cicadas from outside and the creak of the ancient house shifting on its foundations. For long minutes, Shadow stayed frozen, his massive frame trembling, ears pinned back, heart pounding. Then something primal seized him. With a sudden, raw urgency, Shadow threw back his head and howled. It was not a simple bark or cry, it was a deep, harrowing sound, somehow that split the silence like a jagged knife. He howled again, louder, throat straining, voice cracking as if he could summon Elijah back from wherever he had gone. The sound echoed off the cracked walls, ricocheting into the empty corners of the house, filling it with the anguish that words could never carry. Still, the only answer was silence. Beyond the house, the fields lay motionless, the corn sagging in exhaustion under the early summer heat. No cars rattled down the distant road, no neighbors came knocking. The world, it seemed, had folded in on itself, leaving Shadow alone to carry the weight of what had been lost. He paced frantically, nails clicking sharp staccatos against the wood, eyes darting toward the door, then back to Elijah, then to the windows where the sky was bleeding into a mournful gray. He lunged at the door once, twice, his powerful shoulders slamming against the brittle frame, but it held. Shadow spun back toward the bed, whimpered, and then barked sharply, a command meant for a man who would never again give. The morning crept onward with agonizing slowness. The faint warmth left in Elijah's body dissipated, the Purple Heart slipping from his grasp to rest against the sheets like a final punctuation mark. Dust motes floated lazily through shafts of light, uncaring, indifferent. Shadow grew hoarse from his cries, his powerful voice breaking into ragged gasps, but he refused to leave the side of the bed. His instincts screamed for action, guard, protect, alert, but the rules had changed and no amount of training could rewrite the finality he was facing. Hours later, when the sun finally clawed its way over the horizon, bringing with it an oppressive humidity that wrapped around the house like a damp shroud. A distant engine grumbled to life. Shadow stiffened, ears swiveling. The countermen were coming. He had seen them before. From a distance, black suits, grim faces, smelling of cold metal and disinfectant. They came when bad things happened. They would come for Elijah now, and something deep inside Shadow knew he would have to fight to keep him. When the men arrived, their footsteps heavy on the gravel drive, Shadow did not hesitate. He positioned himself between the door and Elijah's still form, muscles coiled, fangs bared. His growl started low, vibrating through the floorboards like the warning rumble of a coming storm. They spoke in soothing tones, tried calling him away, but Shadow would not budge. It was not until one of them, a younger man with a trembling voice, produced a worn piece of cloth that smelled faintly of Elijah, an old jacket left behind in the truck, that Shadow wavered. He hesitated, nostrils flaring, confusion clouding his warrior's heart. In that brief faltering they moved, stepping around him with practiced efficiency. Elijah's body, already shrouded in a gray blanket, was lifted onto the stretcher. Shadow lunged forward, barking furiously, desperate to stop them, to undo the terrible wrong unfolding before his eyes. One of the men muttered under his breath, "Poor thing don't understand." But Shadow understood plenty. He understood that Elijah was being taken somewhere he couldn't follow, that his world was unraveling faster than his mind could make sense of. The stretcher bumped down the porch steps. Shadow followed, barking, growling, pleading in the only language he knew. But they ignored him, talking softly among themselves about paperwork, about regulations, about the time. The county van's rear doors swung open with a metallic groan, and Shadow recoiled at the sudden sterile smell that wafted out antiseptic and finality wrapped in steel and leather. As they loaded Elijah inside, Shadow made one last desperate bid, hurling his body toward the van. Strong hands caught him, pulling him back. He twisted, snarling, snapping, frantic to reach the man he had sworn to follow anywhere. But the doors slammed shut with a brutal finality. The engine rumbled to life, and the van pulled away, kicking up a cloud of dust that hung in the morning air like a lingering ghost. Shadow stood in the center of the yard, chest heaving, the dust settling slowly over his coat. He watched the van disappear down the road, a silent sentinel tethered to grief he couldn't name. Around him, the world remained maddeningly ordinary. The breeze stirred the weeds, a distant rooster crowed, a tractor rumbled far off. But inside Shadow, something had broken wide open, something raw and immense. He turned slowly back toward the empty house, the doorway yawning like a mouth too tired to call anyone home. He took a hesitant step forward, then another, his body trembling with exhaustion and sorrow. Inside, the bed lay stripped and barren, the Purple Heart lying abandoned where it had fallen, its ribbon crumpled and stained by the dust of the floor. Shadow crept toward it, nudging it gently with his nose, the familiar scent of Elijah clinging stubbornly to the fabric. He lay down beside it, curling his body protectively around the metal, his breathing shallow, his eyes fixed unblinkingly on the door through which the world had just stolen everything he knew. Outside, the day grew older, hotter, harsher. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the town buzzed with indifferent life, but within the confines of the broken house, time seemed to halt entirely. The Shadow remained motionless except for the faint tremor running through his limbs, the slow, mournful blink of his heavy eyes. And as the sun continued its merciless climb into the empty sky, a new sound began to build low in his chest. Not the howls of grief, but something quieter, something harder. A vow half-formed but growing stronger with every beat of his loyal heart. Shadow did not sleep. As the day wore on and the sun scorched the brittle earth, he lay curled around the fallen Purple Heart, ears twitching at every distant sound, waiting for the impossible, for a door to swing open, for a familiar voice to call him, but none came. Instead, as the long shadows of evening stretched across the yard, another car approached, slower, heavier, carrying new faces cloaked in the weary detachment of duty. Men in navy uniforms stepped out, their somber expressions betraying the nature of their task. They moved with mechanical precision, hauling a second stretcher, a different kind of burden. The moment Shadow saw the flag-draped coffin lifted from the van, something inside him snapped taut. His muscles coiled under his ragged coat, and without hesitation, he rose, following silently, paws muffled against the dusty ground. He shadowed the men as they maneuvered the coffin into the funeral home across town, blending into the background, invisible to their distracted gazes. His eyes never left the casket, every movement driven by an unwavering instinct he could neither question nor disobey. When they set the coffin inside and began preparations, Shadow attempted to cross the threshold, pushing forward with a sudden burst of frantic energy. One of the younger attendants noticed him at the last second, stepping between him and the door, muttering under his breath, "No animals inside, get out of here." Before Shadow could react, a heavy boot struck his shoulder, sending him sprawling into the dust. For a moment, Shadow lay still, stunned more by betrayal than by pain. He had fought beside men, had bled for them, had saved them in dark places where no sunlight dared to touch, yet now he was nothing more than a stray to be kicked aside. Slowly, shakily, he rose, dust clouding around him like mist. His golden eyes burned, not with anger but with a steadfast grief that even cruelty could not extinguish. He watched in silence as the doors slammed shut, locking Elijah away behind walls too thick for loyalty to breach. Twilight descended quickly, draping the town in a dim, bruised hue. The funeral home's lights flickered on, yellow and sterile behind heavy curtains, shutting Shadow out completely. For long minutes he stood vigil across the street, chest rising and falling in shallow, controlled breaths. Pedestrians passed without noticing him, cars rumbled by, headlights briefly illuminating the lonely figure standing guard. A few curious glances were thrown his way, but no one approached. No one asked why a battle-scarred German shepherd refused to leave the side of a place thick with sorrow. As the last of the workers left and the town folded into uneasy sleep, Shadow retreated into an alley nearby, his ribs brushing against the cracked bricks as he slunk into darkness. He had been trained to wait, to endure, but he understood now that waiting would not be enough. His bond to Elijah demanded more, demanded action. When night fully conquered the sky and a brittle, restless wind swept through the empty streets, Shadow crept back toward the funeral home. A flimsy chain-link fence surrounded the property, its sagging gate padlocked with lazy indifference. Behind it, through the grimy windows, he could still sense the faint, familiar presence of the man who had once pulled him from death's jaws. His heart beat a painful rhythm inside his chest, urging him forward, but the fence stood between them like an accusation. Attached to a rusted pole near the gate was a length of old rope, frayed and weak, tied haphazardly into a noose around Shadow's collar. Someone, perhaps pitying the dog, had tethered him there earlier, hoping to keep him safe until animal control arrived. But pity was a poor substitute for understanding. Shadow sat heavily in the dust, the rope stretching taut against his throat as he strained toward the building. The minutes bled into hours. The town's lights dimmed. The night deepened. The decision came to him not as a thought but as a certainty. With a sudden, brutal twist of his head, Shadow bit down hard on the rope. His powerful jaws, trained to take down men twice his size, shredded the frayed fibers in seconds. The last strand snapped with a whisper of finality, and he stumbled free, coughing but exhilarated. No one noticed his escape. No one cared. The world had already written him off as lost. Shadow did not hesitate. He trotted to the fence, nose pressed against the cold metal, staring at the building where Elijah lay encased in polished wood. He circled once, twice, eyes scanning the perimeter, mind working through the problem like a soldier sizing up an enemy encampment. Finding no way through, he made a choice born of raw instinct. He turned away, back toward the road, back toward the horizon that had swallowed the county van earlier that day. There was only one truth left. Elijah was gone, taken away toward some distant place Shadow did not know, but he could find it. He would find it. The road stretched ahead, shimmering under the pale gaze of the moon, cracked and broken in places but leading onward, always onward. Shadow lowered his head, shoulders squared against the loneliness pressing down on him, and stepped onto the asphalt, paused silent against the stillness. He moved with a deliberate, relentless pace, muscles bunching and releasing in a steady rhythm, his breath forming thin clouds in the cool night air. The town blurred past him, empty gas stations, shuttered diners, Faded houses whose inhabitants slept oblivious to the silent sentinels slipping through their midst. Occasionally a car would pass, headlights sweeping over him like searchlights, but no one stopped. To them, he was just another stray, another shadow among shadows. The first few miles passed in a numb haze. Pain gnawed at his limbs, hunger clawed at his belly, but he pushed forward, fueled by a force older than reason, devotion. Every few steps, he would pause, sniffing the wind, ears swiveling, searching for the faintest trace of Elijah's scent. When he caught it subtle, diluted by distance and dust, the neat lines of the town gave way to open fields, to stretches of forest crouched like sleeping beasts along the roadside. Coyotes howled in the distance, their voices sharp and cruel, but Shadow paid them no mind. His path was clear, his purpose absolute. The stars wheeled above him, cold and indifferent witnesses to the lone figure pacing the dark ribbon of road. His paws grew raw, pads splitting against the rough pavement, but he did not falter. Pain was a familiar companion, one he knew how to carry without complaint. The only thing that mattered was the bond, invisible but unbreakable, pulling him forward like a lifeline through a sea of darkness. Somewhere far ahead, beyond hills and rivers and sleeping towns, Elijah waited. Not in the way he had before, not standing tall, not laughing with that deep, rolling rumble that once made Shadow's tail beat furiously, but waiting all the same. Shadow knew it in the marrow of his bones. And so he ran, silent and unstoppable, a soldier on a final mission he could neither question nor abandon, chasing the fading light of a man who had given him everything. Shadow pressed onward, the miles grinding down his strength, his frame growing leaner under the weight of exhaustion. But he did not falter. The road began to change as the sky paled into an anemic dawn. Neat fields gave way to derelict outskirts, rusted trailers, crumbling gas stations with broken neon signs blinking feebly against the coming day. The scent of Elijah was faint now, stretched thin like smoke on the breeze, but it was enough. Shadow trudged forward, paws leaving smears of blood on the cracked pavement. His breathing labored but steady. As the first rays of sunlight spilled across the earth, Shadow's path veered toward a town so small it barely clung to life, its streets deserted, its paint peeling from abandoned storefronts. Near the edge of town, a group of young men loitered outside a boarded-up convenience store, their laughter sharp and cruel against the brittle morning air. Their pickup trucks sagged with Confederate flag decals and beer cans rattled in the beds. One of them spotted Shadow limping along the shoulder of the road, his dusty coat and bloodied paws marking him as a stray, a nobody. The man whistled low, a sound devoid of kindness. "Look at that nasty mutt," one of them sneered, flicking a cigarette onto the ground. "Probably got rabies or something. Bet he belongs to some junkie." Another picked up a chunk of gravel, tossing it in his palm as he sauntered forward. Shadow slowed, ears flicking back, body tensing. Instinct screamed that these were not friends, not helpers. He lowered his head, nose skimming the ground as if he could make himself invisible. But invisibility was a luxury not afforded to creatures like him, not here, not now. A sharp whistle cut the air, and then the first stone sailed past him, missing by inches. It thudded into the dirt, sending up a puff of dry dust. The second rock struck him square in the haunch, drawing a startled yelp. Shadow bolted, scrambling for the ditch, pain flashing bright in his mind. Laughter erupted behind him, mean and loud, chasing him down the road like a pack of wolves. "Get, ya filthy stray," one of them hollered, throwing another rock that glanced off his ribs. "Ain't no place for mongrels like you here." Their voices followed him, bitter and thick with contempt, words that cut deeper than the stones. Shadow sprinted, heart hammering against his ribs, the scent of Elijah pulling him like a whisper through the rising haze of fear and rage. He had seen it in the eyes of enemies across oceans and deserts, had seen it mirrored in Elijah's weary, knowing gaze when men back home treated him like a second-class citizen despite the medals on his chest. Shadow veered into a narrow alley between two sagging houses, ducking low behind a row of battered trash cans. His flanks heaved, blood trickling from a fresh gash on his side. He stayed hidden, muscles trembling, ears pinned flat as the sound of engines revving and tires spinning on gravel echoed around him. The trucks circled the block once, twice, then finally rumbled away, leaving behind only a choking cloud of dust and the distant, fading jeers. Minutes passed. Slowly, painfully, Shadow unfolded himself from his hiding place. His body stiff, his wounds throbbing with every heartbeat. He limped out onto the cracked sidewalk, head low, eyes darting warily in every direction. The street was empty now, the town holding its breath as if even the buildings themselves were ashamed. Shadow staggered forward, the pull of Elijah's fading scent a fragile thread guiding him through a world determined to forget him. As he passed a sagging porch draped with torn mosquito netting, a movement caught his eye. An old man sat there, hidden in the shadows, a battered cap pulled low over his eyes, a cigarette dangling forgotten between his fingers. His skin was the color of rich earth, creased and weathered by decades of hard living. His eyes sharp and knowing, posite churn instinct caught between flight and trust. The man leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You ain't just any stray, are you?" he rasped, voice like gravel soaked in sorrow. Shadow froze, the familiarity of the tone sinking into his bones. Slowly, cautiously, he edged closer, drawn by something he couldn't name. The man reached into the pocket of his faded overalls and pulled out a piece of dried jerky. Holding it out without expectation, Shadow sniffed the air, trembling with exhaustion, then limped forward to accept the offering. As Shadow chewed, the man spoke, voice low, almost reverent. "You belong to Elijah Brooks, don't you?" Shadow's ears flicked up at the sound of the name, his tail giving a faint, involuntary thump. The old man smiled sadly, the expression creasing his face into a map of old grief. "I knew Elijah," he said, "back when we was boys fightin' wars that didn't love us back." He leaned closer, reaching out a weathered hand to rest gently on Shadow's broad head. The touch was light, respectful, a benediction. "You're on a journey, ain't you, soldier?" Shadow closed his eyes briefly under the touch, the words sinking deep into the marrow of his being. The man's voice dropped to a whisper, cracked and hoarse. Shadow opened his eyes, and for a moment, man and dog stared at each other, an unspoken understanding passing between them. The old man gave a small nod, withdrawing his hand, sitting back into the shadows as if he had merely been a dream conjured by Shadow's fevered mind. No more words were needed. Shadow turned back to the road, his limbs aching, his blood drying stiff against his fur, but his resolve sharper than ever. He took a single step forward, then another, moving with the grim determination of a soldier who has accepted that some missions are carried not for glory, not for victory, but simply because they must be done. The old man watched him go, the faint glow of his cigarette pulsing once, twice, then fading into darkness as the morning sun began to break fully over the horizon, bathing the road ahead in a pale, unforgiving light. Shadow pressed into that light without hesitation, leaving behind the town, the scars, and the hatred, his every step a defiance, a promise. Shadow moved forward into the rising sun, his shadow stretching long and thin across the empty asphalt. His legs burned with every step, each paw strike a dull throb against the broken road. But he pushed onward, driven by a force deeper than pain, deeper even than memory itself. The landscape around him began to shift again, the thin ribbon of highway veering into wild, untamed land where nature had long since reclaimed dominion. Trees leaned over the crumbling road, their gnarled branches like skeletal arms clawing at the sky, and thick undergrowth choked the ditches on either side. Shadow hesitated at the threshold where the road narrowed to a cracked trail swallowed by the forest, his instincts prickling with warning. The scent of Elijah had faded almost completely now, leaving only a ghost of familiarity, but the pull was still there, faint yet unrelenting. Without a sound, Shadow slipped into the trees, the cool darkness closing around him like a shroud. The forest floor was littered with fallen branches and hidden holes, every step a risk. He moved carefully, his body low, every muscle taut with tension. The air was thick with the musk of damp earth and old decay, and somewhere in the distance a brook babbled unseen. The deeper he went, the more the world of men seemed to vanish behind him, swallowed by the living wilderness. It happened so fast he barely registered the snap. One moment Shadow was weaving through a dense thicket, his nose to the ground, and the next, pain exploded in his left hind leg. A trap, rusted but still vicious, had clamped down with brutal force, its jagged teeth digging deep into muscle and sinew. Shadow yelped, a sharp, involuntary sound that shattered the heavy silence of the woods. He thrashed instinctively, trying to free himself, but the trap held fast, its rusted chain anchoring him to a buried stake. Blood poured from the wound, soaking his fur, the scent of iron heavy in the air. Shadow whined low in his throat, his breath coming in short, desperate pants. Panic threatened to overtake him, clouding his mind, but somewhere beneath the rising tide of fear, his training reasserted itself. He stilled, forcing his body to go rigid, conserving energy, assessing the situation. With agonizing slowness, he shifted his weight, twisting the trapped leg to relieve the pressure. His teeth found the rusted hinge of the trap, gnawing and pulling with desperate determination. Minutes dragged into an eternity. Finally, with a groan of protesting metal, the trap sprang loose and Shadow collapsed onto his side, free but bleeding heavily. He lay there for a moment, trembling, gathering what little strength he had left. The pain was a living thing now, pulsing through his body with every heartbeat, but he knew he could not stay. Elijah's path still called to him, faint and fragile, and if he stopped, if he gave in to the pain, he would never find him. Dragging himself upright, Shadow limped forward, his injured leg barely touching the ground. Every step sent fresh bolts of agony through him, but he gritted his teeth against it, forging ahead. The forest thinned gradually, the trees giving way to an overgrown field choked with wild grasses and thorn bushes. Beyond it, shimmering in the midday heat, was a road, another artery of cracked asphalt leading somewhere. Anywhere but here. Shadow staggered into the open, the sun beating down mercilessly on his battered frame. He swayed on his feet, blinking against the brightness, his head drooping low with exhaustion. Across the road, tucked into a forgotten corner of an overgrown park, something caught his eye. A shape dark and still against the green. Drawn by a compulsion he didn't understand, Shadow limped toward it, his movements slow and labored. As he drew closer, the shape resolved into a statue. A soldier cast in bronze, his rifle slung across his back, his gaze fixed somewhere far beyond the horizon. The figure was tall, proud, and unmistakably black, the lines of his face carved with the same weary determination that had once etched Elijah's features. Weeds had crept up around the base of the monument, obscuring the plaque, and the once bright metal had dulled to a somber patina. But the power of the image was undiminished. Shadow stopped at the base of the statue, his chest heaving, blood matting the fur around his wounded leg. He stared up at the silent sentinel, his ears flattening slightly against his skull. For a long moment, neither moved, the dog and the monument locked in a quiet communion. Then, without warning, Shadow threw back his head and barked a short, sharp sound that echoed off the empty playground equipment and the abandoned picnic tables, reverberating into the lonely afternoon. It was not a bark of fear nor of warning, but a call, a greeting, a soldier recognizing another, bound by battles fought in different times but under the same unforgiving sky. The statue offered no response, only the eternal vigilance carved into its bronze face. But Shadow's heart lifted slightly, the crushing weight of isolation easing just enough to let him breathe. He circled the base once, twice, as if standing guard, before lowering himself gingerly onto the cracked concrete at the statue's feet. His body trembled with pain and fatigue, but his eyes remained bright, unwearying. He rested there a while, gathering strength, letting the silent presence of the monument seep into him, a reminder that he was not truly alone. Others had walked this path before him, had fought, had fallen. The breeze stirred the grass around him, carrying the faintest whiff of asphalt and dust, of road stretching endlessly into the unknown. Shadow's ears twitched, his body tensing in readiness. The moment of reprieve was over. Duty called, relentless and unyielding. With a grunt of effort, Shadow pushed himself to his feet, his wounded leg dragging slightly behind him. He gave one last glance at the statue, a silent salute, then turned his face back toward the road. The sun had shifted while he rested, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement, and the air vibrated with the hum of unseen insects. Step by painful step, Shadow moved forward once more, the battered soldier continuing his march through an indifferent world. carrying with him the memory of those who had fought before, the promise of loyalty forged in the crucible of shared struggle, and the fading, stubborn scent of the man who had meant everything. Shadow stumbled onward, every step a brutal negotiation between will and failing flesh, the road rising and falling beneath him like the heaving of some restless giant. His vision blurred at the edges, colors bleeding into one another, the world reduced to instinct and memory, the only constants the burning in his wounded leg and the whisper of Elijah's presence. So faint now it might have been a dream. The asphalt turned to gravel, the gravel to dirt, and the dirt to broken, uneven ground littered with trash and jagged stones. Overhead, the sun slipped behind a curtain of thickening clouds, casting the world into a murky half-light that seemed to sap what little strength Shadow had left. He passed abandoned lots where rusted cars sat on cinder blocks, skeletal playgrounds where swings creaked in the breeze, and houses sagging in defeat, their windows boarded up like blind, empty eyes. The road narrowed again, sloping downward toward an old bridge spanning a dry, weed-choked creek bed. The bridge was little more than a skeleton of cracked concrete and rusted rebar, graffiti scrawled across its pillars in angry, desperate colors. Shadow made it halfway across before his body betrayed him. His legs buckled without warning and he crumpled onto the rough surface, sighs heaving, tongue lolling from his mouth. He lay there for a moment, trying to will himself upright, but his body refused. With a final shuddering effort, he dragged himself toward the edge of the bridge and tumbled down the embankment, landing hard on the dry creek bed below. The world tilted and spun around him, the sky a swirling mass of bruised purple and gray. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, uneven rhythm, and for the first time since Elijah had left, Shadow felt the icy fingers of despair claw at his resolve. Above him, the sky darkened further as dusk swallowed the land. Streetlights flickered to life along the distant road, their light feeble and stuttering, casting long, trembling shadows. Somewhere far off, a siren wailed, a thin, mournful sound that echoed off the broken buildings and empty streets. Shadow lay motionless under the bridge, blood crusting in his fur, his breathing shallow and labored. He closed his eyes, the edges of his consciousness fraying like an old flag caught in a storm. It was in that broken moment that Amara found him. The little girl had been wandering further than she was supposed to, her well-worn sneakers kicking up puffs of dust as she explored the forgotten edges of her world. She was small for her 10 years, with tightly braided hair and wide, watchful eyes that missed little. Her backpack, patched and faded, bounced against her narrow shoulders as she walked. She had seen the dog from the road, a crumpled heap of fur and bone half hidden by the shadows. And despite the warnings that echoed in her mind, warnings about strays, about danger, something pulled her closer. Carefully, cautiously, Amara scrambled down the embankment, stones slipping under her feet. She approached the fallen dog with slow, deliberate steps, her heart thudding loudly in her chest. Up close, she could see how bad it was. The blood matted into the dog's coat, the torn flesh of his hind leg, the ribs jutting sharply beneath his skin. But there was something else, something that stopped her from running away in fear. His eyes. They were open, clouded with pain but burning still with a fierce, unbroken light. "Hey boy," Amara whispered, dropping to her knees a few feet away. Her voice was soft, coaxing, the way her grandmother spoke to scared animals. "It's okay, I'm not gonna hurt you." Shadow's ears twitched weakly at the sound, his nose twitching toward her scent soap, dust, and the faint sweetness of bubblegum. He made no move to rise, no sound of protest, only a low, tremulous whine that spoke of pain and exhaustion beyond words. Amara's gaze fell to the collar around his neck, the metal tag dangling from it catching the flickering light of a nearby street lamp. She inched closer, heart hammering, and reached out with trembling fingers to grasp the tag. She turned it over, squinting to read the worn engraving, "Elijah Brooks." She read aloud, her voice barely a whisper. She frowned, the words spinning in her mind, assembling themselves into a meaning she didn't fully understand but recognized as important. A name, a place, a mission. She knew where St. Mary's was, everyone in town did. It was the old chapel up on the hill, the one where the big funerals happened, the ones with flags and uniforms and rows of crying people. Maria looked down at the dog again, her young face hardening with resolve. She didn't know who Elijah Brooks was, but she knew this dog belonged to him, and she knew somehow that the dog needed to get to that chapel. She pulled off her backpack, rummaging through it for anything that might help. A torn hoodie, a half-empty bottle of water, a handful of crackers. She placed the hoodie gently over Shadow's trembling body, trying to offer some semblance of warmth. She unscrewed the bottle cap and poured a little water into her cupped hand, offering it to him. Shadow licked weakly at the water, his tongue rough against her palm, each swallow a tiny victory against the darkness threatening to pull him under. Amara smiled through the sting of tears gathering in her eyes. "You're not gonna die here, boy," she said fiercely, her voice trembling with determination. "You hear me? You're not. You're gonna make it. You're gonna make it." No help was coming. She would have to be the help. Slinging her backpack over one shoulder, she slipped an arm carefully under Shadow's chest, trying to lift him. He was heavy, far too heavy for her slight frame, but she gritted her teeth and managed to shift him enough to get him partly onto the hoodie, fashioning it into a makeshift sling. Grunting with effort, Amara began dragging Shadow toward the slope leading back up to the road, the dog whimpering softly, but making no move to resist. Inch by painful inch, they made their way upward, the gravel biting into Amara's knees, the air sharp and cold against her flushed cheeks. Above them, the streetlights buzzed and flickered, casting uncertain pools of light onto the cracked asphalt. Somewhere in the distance, the chapel bells began to toll, slow and mournful, their sound carrying across the broken landscape like a summons from another world. Amara paused at the top of the embankment, her chest heaving, and looked down at Shadow, who lay still but breathing, his gaze locked onto hers with a trust that shattered her heart. She didn't know how far they had to go, or how they would make it, but she knew one thing with a certainty that defied her. They had to keep moving. The air changed first, a sudden stillness that made the hairs on the back of Amara's neck stand up, a silence so heavy it felt like the world itself was holding its breath. She tightened her grip on the corners of the hoodie, dragging Shadow another few inches along the cracked road, sweat and grime streaking her face. The sky above them had turned an ugly shade of greenish-gray, the clouds churning like a living thing, and in the distance, a low rumble of thunder rolled across the hills, growing louder with each passing second. Mara looked up, her heart sinking. She knew what was coming, had seen it before on nights when the sirens wailed and her mother hustled her into the bathtub with a mattress over their heads. A storm was coming, and it wasn't going to be a small one. Shadow lifted his head weakly, his ears flicking toward the distant sound, his body tense despite his injuries. He smelled it too, the ozone sharpness of lightning, the earthy churn of the coming rain. An instinct clawed at him, telling him to seek shelter, to hide, to survive. But another instinct, deeper and more unyielding, whispered otherwise. Move forward no matter what, find a light. The first fat drops of rain hit the road with sharp, sizzling pops, darkening the asphalt in erratic patches. Amara pulled her hood up over her braids, blinking against the sudden onslaught, her small hands raw and scraped from pulling Shadow mile after mile. The rain thickened into a curtain, blinding and cold, washing away the dust and blood from Shadow's matted fur, turning the road into a slick, treacherous river of mud and debris. The wind howled down from the hills, tearing at Amara's hoodie, pushing against her with invisible, brutal hands. She staggered but did not fall, tightening her grip on Shadow's makeshift sling with a grimace of determination. The world around them blurred into a chaos of water and motion. Ditches overflowed in minutes, sending torrents of filthy runoff across the broken road, carving new channels through the brittle earth. Fallen branches whipped across their path, and overhead, power lines swung wildly, spitting sparks into the rain. Visibility shrank to mere feet, the chapel on the hill now just a fading memory, a distant dream obscured by the storm's wrath. Amara's sneakers squelched through the mud, each step a battle against gravity and exhaustion. She slipped and fell more than once, her palms skinned raw, her knees bloodied, but each time she scrambled back up, dragging Shadow with her. The dog, sensing her desperation, tried to rise on his own, his muscles bunching and trembling with the effort, his wounded leg dragging behind him like a dead weight. Together they lurched forward, two battered souls defying a world intent on breaking them. Lightning forked across the sky in jagged veins of white fire, illuminating the shattered landscape in brief, terrifying flashes. Thunder cracked overhead, so loud and close it rattled Amara's teeth. She screamed into the wind, a wordless cry of rage and terror, but it was swallowed whole by the storm. The rain beat down harder, a relentless wall of water that blurred the line between earth and sky, between hope and despair. A sudden surge of floodwater barreled down the road, carrying with it branches, trash, and broken shards of humanity. Amara shrieked as the water hit them, knocking her off her feet, sweeping her a few yards down the road before she managed to snag a broken fence post jutting from the ground. She clung to it with all her scream, her arms screaming in protest as Shadow whimpering as he struggled to find purchase against the slick, crumbling asphalt. Somehow, impossibly, they held on. When the worst of the surge passed, leaving behind a sodden wasteland of mud and wreckage, Amara hauled herself upright, coughing and choking on muddy water. She staggered back to Shadow, dropping to her knees beside him. The dog lay shivering, his breathing ragged, but when she touched his shoulder, he lifted his head and looked at her with eyes that still burned with stubborn, unbroken fire. "You have to keep going," Amara gasped, tears mixing with rain on her cheeks. "We have to." Shadow pushed himself upright, every movement a labor of will against a body that wanted nothing more than to lie down and sleep forever. His paws sank into the mud, the wound on his leg oozing fresh blood that was quickly washed away by the rain. He wobbled, nearly fell, but then something unseen seemed to lift him, to steel his limbs against the inevitable collapse. Somewhere just beyond the edge of the storm, Shelijah was waiting. Shadow lowered his head and plunged forward into the muck, muscles locking into the familiar rhythm of a march. Amara stumbled after him, her hands clenched into fists, her breath coming in ragged sobs. Step by painful step, they moved together through the storm, two tiny figures swallowed by the vast, indifferent fury of nature. The road was no longer a road but a river of mud and debris, each step a gamble against hidden dangers. More than once, Shadow's paws sank deep into unseen potholes, twisting his battered limbs painfully, but he pressed onward, barking hoarsely into the storm as if challenging it to stop him. His voice, raw and broken, carried through the wind and rain like a beacon, a declaration that he was still here, that he would not be turned aside. Mara heard that bark and found new strength within herself. She dug her heels into the mud, using her whole body to push forward, matching Shadow step for agonizing step. The two of them became a single creature, a single will, forged in pain and loss and defiance. Above them, the storm raged on, a living thing of chaos and destruction. But within that chaos, a fragile thread of hope endured. They moved toward it blindly, instinctively, drawn by a bond that neither the heavens nor the earth could sever. And somewhere, carried on the howling wind, came a voice not heard by ears, but felt deep within the heart, a voice that whispered in the cadence of Elijah's memory. "Keep moving." The storm raged on with merciless fury, but somehow, impossibly, Shadow and Amara pressed forward, battered but unbroken, each agonizing step a silent rebellion against the forces arrayed against them. Mud clung to their legs like chains, and the wind howled with voices that seemed to mock their struggle, but neither surrendered. They had no words left between them, only a raw, desperate will to reach whatever awaited them beyond the mail street. The road ahead was a blur of shifting water and broken debris, an ever-changing battlefield that demanded constant sacrifice. Shadow limped heavily, his wounded leg dragging, blood seeping anew from reopened gashes, but his golden eyes burned with a fire that no rain could extinguish. Then, through the hammering wall of rain, headlights appeared, cutting sharp white scars across the darkness. A convoy of trucks, battered but sturdy, crawled up the road, their engines growling low and steady against the storm's banshee screams. Amara blinked up at them, hope flaring briefly in her chest. The trucks were painted with the battered insignias of relief organization's Red Cross. Doors swung open, and figures in rain-soaked ponchos jumped down, waving their arms, shouting words that were mostly lost to the wind. "Hey, over here, come on, we'll get you to shelter." A tall woman with a kind face and outstretched hands waded into the floodwater, beckoning frantically. Behind her, a group of volunteers hurried to set up tarps and makeshift barriers against the worst of the wind. Amara's legs wobbled with exhaustion and relief, and for the briefest moment, she thought of letting go, of falling into the safety they offered. letting someone else carry this impossible burden. She took a staggering step toward them, her arms trembling with the effort of dragging Shadow's weight through the mud. Shadow stopped. His body tensed, ears flicking, nose lifted into the chaotic air. Something beyond sight, beyond sound, called to him, a whisper threading through the cacophony, a sense so familiar it pierced the fog of exhaustion and pain like a blade. He sniffed again, deeper this time, and his whole body went rigid. Elijah, beneath the stench of mud and gasoline, beneath the metallic tang of rain and the acrid smoke of downed power lines. Shadow caught the unmistakable scent of Elijah's military jacket, the one he had worn into battle, the one that had soaked up the man's sweat, blood, and hope over years of service. It was a scent seared into Shadow's very soul, a tether unbreakable by time or death. And it was not coming from the trucks. It was coming from down the road, deeper into the heart of the storm, where the darkness thickened and the air grew colder. The volunteers kept calling, their voices urgent, desperate. Amara turned to Shadow, her face pale and hollowed by fear and fatigue. "Come on, boy," she begged, tugging gently on the corner of the hoodie still wrapped around him. "Please, we have to go, they'll help us." Shadow looked at her, their gazes locking for a heartbeat in the storm-ravaged night. She saw it then, not stubbornness, not fear, but certainty, something ancient and sacred that she could not name. With a soft whine, he pulled free of her grasp, turning away from the safety of the trucks, away from the outstretched hands and promises of warmth. He faced the darkness ahead, body trembling but resolute, and took a step forward. Amara's heart broke as she realized he wasn't going to follow her. She stood rooted in the mud, torn between survival and loyalty, between the world of men and the bond between a dog and a soldier. Volunteer grabbed her arm, trying to pull her toward the truck, but she shook him off, her eyes never leaving Shadow's battered form as he limped away, each step slow but determined, each movement a prayer whispered into the teeth of the storm. "Wait," she cried, stumbling after him, but the mud sucked at her feet, the wind clawed at her body, and the volunteers closed in around her, pulling her back toward safety. Shadow didn't look back. He moved forward as if guided by an unseen hand, his nose low to the ground, his body following the thin, precious thread of a lifeline. Each breath brought the scent stronger, clearer, cutting through the noise and pain like a beacon. The trucks behind him revved their engines, doors slamming shut as the volunteers prepared to move on, taking with them the last fragile offer of comfort and rescue. Shadow didn't flinch. His world had narrowed to a single point on the horizon, a single promise made long ago in the twilight hours of an Alabama porch. "If I fall, you find me." The rain intensified, turning the road into a churning river, but Shadow waded through it, his movements slow but unwearying. The water rose to his chest, then his neck, and still he pushed forward, paddling with weary but determined strokes. The current pulled at him, tried to drag him under, but he fought it with every ounce of strength left in his battered body. Somewhere far ahead, beyond the floodwaters and fallen trees, beyond the broken promises and indifferent heavens, lay the place he was meant to reach, and he would reach it or die trying. Amara watched through a veil of tears as Shadow disappeared into the storm, a lone figure swallowed by the darkness, carrying with him the hopes and sorrows of a world that had forgotten how to believe in such loyalty. The trucks rumbled away, leaving behind only the empty road, the endless rain, and the faint, unwavering echo of a dog's determined heart beating against the void. Shadow pressed onward through the battering rain, every step a small defiance against the aching pull of exhaustion that gnawed at his bones. The road beneath his paws was a slick, treacherous river of mud and broken debris, each step heavier than the last. His chest heaved with the effort of breathing, his eyes remained fixed ahead, locked onto a goal only he could see. The scent of Elijah was stronger now, almost tangible, a thread so close he could almost taste it on his tongue. Somewhere beyond the next rise, beyond the next bend, the promise of reunion waited. The storm still howled around him, a raging fury that seemed intent on swallowing him whole. But Shadow was deaf to its threats, blind to its chaos. His world had shrunk to the thin ribbon of road before him, and the memory of a promise whispered into the night. He stumbled more than once, his paws slipping on the water-slick asphalt, his body sagging under its own weight, but he refused to stop. The trees thinned, the ground leveled, and through the curtain of rain a shape began to emerge. A spire tall and crooked, its cross gleaming faintly under the lightning-stitched sky. St. Mary's Chapel standing stubbornly against the storm like a sentinel, waiting for him. Hope flared in Shadow's chest, a painful brightness that made him push harder, faster, dragging his broken body up the final slope. Only 500 meters remained, a stretch of road that might as well have been an ocean. Shadow's breath came in shallow, rattling gasps, each inhale a battle, each exhale a surrender. His wounded leg buckled under him and he staggered, righted himself, staggered again. The world tilted and spun around him, the lines between sky and earth blurring into a single heaving mass. He tried to bark, to announce his arrival, to call out to the spirit he knew was waiting, but only a broken whimper escaped his raw throat. Another step, another. His vision narrowed to a dark tunnel rimmed with fire. He could see the chapel doors now, just beyond the low stone wall that marked the edge of the grounds. Light spilled from the arched windows, warm and golden, a beacon against the storm's fury. Figures moved inside, blurred and indistinct, gathering for the final farewell to the man who had meant everything. Shadow's heart surged with longing, a desperate need to be there, to complete his mission, to lay himself at Elijah's side one last time, but his body betrayed him. With a strangled whine, Shadow's legs collapsed beneath him, sending him sprawling onto the flooded road. He lay there, chest heaving, water pooling around him, the chapel so achingly close and yet impossibly far. He tried to rise, muscles trembling with the effort, but his limbs refused to obey. His strength bled away by the endless miles and the count. He could only watch, helpless, as the world blurred and darkened around the edges, the light from the chapel flickering like a distant star on the verge of extinction. For a moment, Shadow lay utterly still, the rain drumming against his broken body, the storm's roar fading into a dull, mournful hum. He closed his eyes, surrendering to the pull of oblivion, the thought of failure a bitter knife twisting it. He had come so far, fought so hard, and yet he would fall short, left to die alone in the mud, like so many forgotten soldiers before him. But fate had not finished with him yet. A pair of boots splashed through the floodwater, their tread heavy but sure. A voice, rough with age and raw emotion, cut through the storm. Jesus Christ! Shadow's ears twitched weakly at the sound, his eyelids fluttering open. A figure loomed above him, hunched against the rain, a face lined with years of hard living and harder memories. The old man dropped to his knees beside Shadow, his hands gentle despite their roughness, his touch trembling as he ran them over the dog's sodden fur. "Oh my God, it's really you!" the man whispered, forced. Tears mingled with the rain on his weathered cheeks as he gathered Shadow into his arms, cradling the broken body against his chest. The old man grunted with effort, rising to his feet with Shadow held close, the dog's head lolling weakly against his shoulder. "Hold on, boy," he choked out, turning toward the chapel. "Just a little more, just a little longer, kid. We're almost there." The old man, Franklin Turner, once a comrade in arms to Elijah Brooks, once a brother by blood spilled and battle shared, stumbled toward the chapel, his legs unsteady, his heart hammering with grief and determination. Each step was a prayer, a plea to whatever gods might be listening. The mourners inside the chapel heard the shouting, the splashing footsteps, and turned in confusion as Franklin burst through the doors, soaked to the bone, cradling the limp, battered form of a dog that should not have been able to make the journey he had just endured. The air inside the chapel was warm, filled with the low murmur of voices and the scent of lilies and damp wool. Franklin staggered down the aisle, past rows of stunned faces, past the casket draped in a flag, toward the altar where Elijah Brooks lay in solemn repose. Shadow stirred weakly in his arms, his nose twitching, his body straining toward the familiar scent that flooded the air. "Hang on, soldier," Franklin rasped, his voice a broken whisper. "Almost there, boy, almost there." Franklin staggered the last few steps to the front of the chapel, the weight of Shadow cradled in his arms heavier than anything he had carried through years of war and loss. The mourners rose to their feet in stunned silence, eyes wide and glistening, watching the battered figure of the old soldier and the dying dog moving toward the casket where Elijah Brooks lay in state, the flag folded neatly atop the polished mahogany lid. The rain hammered against the stained glass windows, casting fractured rainbows across the wooden pews. The storm outside still raging, but inside the chapel, time seemed to slow, the air thick with unspoken prayers and memories that clung to the walls like mist. Franklin knelt at the foot of the casket, his arms trembling, his face twisted with grief, and with infinite care he laid Shadow down onto the cool stone floor. Shadow lay still for a moment, his sides heaving, his fur matted with blood and mud, his body so battered that even breathing seemed an act of impossible defiance. The scent of Elijah, rich and warm and achingly familiar, filled his senses, pushing back the pain, pushing back the darkness that clawed at the edges of his mind. Somewhere deep inside, a spark flared, small but fierce, a soldier's final rally against the inevitable. His claws scraped weakly against the stone as he tried to rise, his legs wobbling, muscles spasming from the effort. The pallbearers, already moving to lift the casket and begin the slow march toward the grave prepared outside, paused, uncertainty flickering across their faces. Franklin, his voice hoarse with emotion, whispered, "Wait, give him a minute," and the others froze. The casket suspended mid-air between life and death, between farewell and eternity. Shadow's limbs trembled violently, but with a strength born not from flesh but from the unbreakable bond of loyalty and love, he pushed himself upright. His body quivered with each movement, but he took a step forward, then another, dragging his wounded leg behind him, leaving a trail of blood and mud across the polished floor. Every eye in the chapel was locked onto him, every breath held, as the battered dog made his final approach to the man who had saved him, trained him, loved him beyond all understanding. He reached the casket just as Franklin's strength gave out, and the pallbearers could hold no longer, their arms lowering Elijah gently onto the bier prepared for the final goodbye. Shadow stumbled the last few feet, collapsing against the side of the casket, his body sagging with exhaustion, but he lifted his head, his muzzle pressed against the wood. The scent of Elijah was strongest here, rich with memories of battles fought side by side, of nights spent under foreign stars, of whispered promises made and kept. With a trembling effort, Shadow reared up, his front paws scraping against the smooth surface of the coffin. He nudged the flag aside with his nose, the silk slipping like water under his touch, and found the spot just over the heart, the place where Elijah had once cradled him as a terrified pup, the place where a bond had been forged that death itself could not sever. Shadow laid his head there, his body shuddering with the effort, and closed his eyes. A low, keening sound built in his chest, a sound too deep and ancient to be called a simple whine or cry. It rose, trembling and raw, into a full-throated howl that filled the chapel, echoing off the rafters, vibrating through the pews, threading its way into the hearts of everyone present. It was a sound of mourning and love and rage against the dying of the light, a song older than language, a cry that said, "I am here, I have found you, I will not leave you." People wept openly, their faces buried in hands, shoulders shaking, the walls of stoic pride crumbling under the weight of that pure, unbearable grief. Even the toughest of the old soldiers, men who had seen friends torn apart on battlefields, who had buried brothers under foreign suns, found themselves undone by the sight of the dying dog mourning his fallen master. Shadow's howl faded into a ragged breath, and he sagged against the casket, his strength spent. Franklin moved forward, his own tears lost in the river running from his battered face, and knelt beside him, placing a trembling hand on the dog's heaving side. "You did it, boy," he whispered, his voice breaking. "You found him. You brought him home." Shadow's ear twitched at the sound, his tail giving one last, faint thump against the floor. His body relaxed, the tension bleeding away, leaving behind only peace. He exhaled a long, shuddering breath, and in that breath was everything: gratitude, love, and the unbreakable fulfillment of a soldier's final mission. Outside, the storm began to break, the thunder receding into the distance, the rain easing into a gentle mist that kissed the ground. The sun, hidden for so long, broke through the clouds in slanting golden rays that pierced the stained glass, bathing the chapel in a warm, ethereal light. The bells of St. Mary's began to toll, slow and solemn, their sound rolling out across the town, calling the living and the dead to bear witness. Franklin stayed by Shadow's side, one hand resting on the dog's back, the other gripping the edge of Elijah's casket as if to anchor himself against a grief too vast for words. Around them, the mourners began to sing, low and broken at first, then rising stronger, a hymn of farewell and hope and the enduring power of bonds that even death could not sever. And as the final notes of the song lifted toward the heavens, the last light of day caught the battered purple hard metal that someone had placed atop Elijah's chest, making it gleam for one brief, glorious moment, a beacon for a soul finally at rest. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more stories that remind us of the strength of loyalty, sacrifice, and love. Which moment in Shadow's journey moved you the most? Were you reading from home, at work, or somewhere unexpected? I'd love to hear where you are and what part of this story stayed with you most. Share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters here.